Hello and welcome to Season 11, Episode 8 of Unlimited Opinions, the final episode of Season 11. I'm Adam Bishop.
I'm Mark Bishop.
And we are, of course, reading J.R.R. Tolkien's The Monsters and the Critics and other essays, this time discussing the last essay in this collection, the Valedictory Address to the University of Oxford. What'd you think of this one overall?
Oh, I liked it. I mean, there's like a middle section. He goes into some detail about different schools or different interests within the school of linguistics, I guess, or philology. And so that was more of a curiosity than something I was really interested in. But again, he just has a way with words. It's fun to read his stuff, and so I liked it. What do you think?
Yeah, I really enjoy this one because I think it talks a little bit more broadly just about like education in general.
Yes.
It's also kind of an interesting speech. I think I mentioned this maybe an episode ago or so, but this was delivered as he was leaving Oxford, so at the end of his last term teaching. And so it's usually when you take up the chair of one of the colleges or things like that, or one of the departments, you would give like a speech to everybody, but he kind of references in here, there was just not an opportunity for him to do so. And so he's kind of giving his introductory address as he's leaving. It's also kind of interesting because he's kind of just complaining about like the current state of Oxford.
Yes.
As he's leaving, this really great professor. He's like, you guys are doing some things wrong. Get back on the right track here if you really want to make your education worthwhile. Yeah. I think it's really interesting in that regard.
Yes. And this was what, in 1959?
59.
Mm-hmm. So a few years before I was even born.
Yes, 11 to be exact.
That's correct. So it's a long time ago. But yeah, still timely, about the education, and I don't know if it's really that timely still within that field, that particular field, but it talks about certain general principles, and you can kind of feel like he's speaking to you, like you're in the audience. So it's well written, and I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I like his introduction because he starts by saying like, I really have nothing special to say.
Yeah.
Of course, being like ridiculously humble because he does have a lot to say. But he says, the diagnosis of what is wrong and the confident prescription of the cure, the wide view, the masterly survey, plans and prophecies, these have never been in my line. I would always rather try to wring the juice out of a single sentence or explore the implications of one word than to try and sum up a period in a lecture or pot a poet in a paragraph. And I'm afraid that what I would rather do is what I have usually done. So he's like, I've done what I've wanted throughout my career, and I'm just not good at describing the big picture of things. But of course, he very much is, and that's what he does throughout this whole essay or this whole address.
Yeah, like how he opens it up, and he's talking about why he didn't give an inaugural, an introductory or inaugural lecture. And I guess he didn't initially, and then he figured he wouldn't do it later because he says, it seemed to me that an inaugural that would not inaugurate was a ceremony better omitted. And then he says in the next paragraph, he says, 14 more years have now passed, and I still have nothing special to say. Yeah. Oh, okay. And he talks about, I think it seems like a main part of his speech after he gets through the introductory stuff, and it was kind of funny. He has this defense of philology that, of course, is a field that I have really no interest in. I'll be honest. Not that I dislike it. It's just it's not something that I've ever really given much thought to. But he has such a passion for it,
right.
and he considers it like an art form, even like the study of it.
Right.
I just like on 225, he says. Convinced of what? Convinced that philology is never nasty, except to those deformed in youth and suffering from some congenital deficiency. So he really has a love for it. Right. And anybody who doesn't, he would think that I guess he'd probably think that I was somebody who was deformed in youth and had some congenital deficiency. He has a really neat way of insulting people.
Yes, no, he does.
Yeah,
he does.
But I get the sense that he is saying it tongue in cheek.
Right.
I don't think he's really mean spirited.
Because he goes on to say, he's like, the people who think philology is nasty, well, they have to be, deformed in some way. But he says, I do not think that it should be thrust down throats as a pill.
Correct.
Because I think that if such a process seems needed, the sufferer should not be here, at least not studying or teaching English letters. Yeah. Philology is the foundation of humane letters. Misology, the hate of words, is a disqualifying defect or disease. And so he's saying, you can't force it down because
Yeah.
really you should like it if you're here at Oxford, if you want to have this education in humane letters. And that becomes like the crux of this whole essay, because it's what he calls the difference between lang and lit. And he gives some discussion beforehand as well, when he's talking about like research and things like that on pages 226 and 227. Because he says, we've put essentially like too much emphasis on like cranking out a research project. And he kind of gives this alternate like idea of education. He says, well, it should be an option for people to just study and read and then take like an examination at the end and then have some sort of degree. But we've sort of pivoted in this sort of master's research direction over the past few years at Oxford, from his perspective.
Yes.
And he's really describing just sort of the shift in modern education as a whole. Because like his alternative is really what education would have been like for many centuries prior, where you just study what came before and then sort of evaluate it, have an exam or write a big paper on it. But now there's such an emphasis on like some sort of new research. And he has some really great phrases in here. I don't know if I'll be able to find them right away, but he's like cramming together like bits and pieces of things to try and cobble together a thesis. And that is kind of the attitude of a lot of people in grad school, where it's like you don't really have, at least with some people, you don't really have like that interest in research. So you're just kind of cobbling together things that you like and like throwing together some sort of big research, quote unquote, project.
Yeah. And I think it's also, he doesn't really address it here, but like the super specialization. So, you don't have, he does kind of touch on it at some point. I don't know if I have it highlighted later, but where people only are concerned with one particular area of interest, and they super specialize in it. And of course, a lot of people in modern times, they're an expert in one field, and they think that makes them qualified to speak as an expert on anything else, which usually means that they are. In the modern world, they have no idea what's going on in the rest of the world. But I did like, he talks about on 225. We go back a little bit.
Sure.
I thought this quote was really neat. And I think it's a reference to teachers, professors, educators generally, or even like bosses in some respects. He said, but he says. He says, talking about being dull, and dullness is to be pitied. He says, but dullness should be confessed with humility, and I have therefore felt it a grievance that certain professional persons should suppose their dullness and ignorance to be a human norm, the measure of what is good, and anger when they have sought to impose the limitations of their minds upon younger minds, dissuading those with philological curiosity from their bent, encouraging those without this interest to believe that their lack marked them as minds of a superior order. And I think it's a fancy way of saying, it's a lot of teachers and educators, professors or whatever, in some ways don't encourage their students to be better than them. It's like they kind of push it down. At least that's why I read part of what he's saying.
Yeah, and I like how he follows up, too, because he says, this is what sort of those quote-unquote professionals do. He says, but I am, as I say, an amateur. And if that means that I have neglected parts of my large field, devoting myself mainly to those things that I personally like, it does also mean that I have tried to awake liking, to communicate delight in those things that I find enjoyable. Now, without suggesting that they were the only proper source of profit or pleasure for students of English. Yeah. Just like, I'm not trying to force, whatever students came under me to be like, this is the way you have to go. This is my field of study. Therefore, it has to be yours. Yes. I'm an amateur as much as they are in many ways. If I could just encourage them to like a topic and then go down that path, then that's sort of my job as the educator.
Yeah. Well, I remember one of my first professors, I think it was the first, well, it must have been the first philosophy, not philology, philosophy course. It was a history of philosophy, and it was an ancient professor, but he was so enthusiastic about the subject, and he was not, he made an argument or of sorts at the beginning of the class, like generally, this is why the study of philosophy is important, because it's the foundation of everything else. Right. If you had a good teacher, if you've thought about it, you follow that. And his enthusiasm for it was just so contagious, and really caught my interest in that subject. I was a little interested already. Obviously, it's not it for that class, but then I had another professor who was a logic professor. He was actually a mathematician, so he taught me calculus, although I didn't learn it very well in college, and also logic, and separately. So he was in the philosophical department and the mathematics department. So. And he had a tremendous enthusiasm for logic. logic and language, formal logic, and all that stuff. It's a great. It's probably the best teacher I ever had.
Interesting.
And so I suspect that Tolkien's enthusiasm for the subject, even if he, wasn't teaching his favorite subjects, his enthusiasm for that subject, it probably would have carried through.
I'd imagine. Yeah. I like what he says also. This paragraph on 227. Again, kind of talking about like the research and sort of like forcing topics upon students. He says, one must feel grave disquiet when the legitimate inspiration is not there, when the subject or topic of research is imposed or is found for a candidate out of someone else's bag of curiosities, or is thought by a committee to be a sufficient exercise for a degree. Whatever may have been found useful in other spheres, there is distinction between accepting the willing labor of many humble persons in building an English house and the erection of a pyramid with the sweat of degree slaves.
Yes.
That's powerful language.
Yeah.
And it makes it just so funny, like just imagining how this would have been given, right? He's talking to a bunch of Oxford professors as he's leaving. Like this is his last address at the university. He's saying, like, do not make this pyramid with the sweat of degree slaves.
Yes.
Forcing your own research upon other students. Let them bring in other sort of topics into things.
It's funny. I have that paragraph highlighted.
Oh, there you go.
Great minds think alike.
Oh, sure do.
He mentions the thing I wanted to ask you about this. He kind of segues from that into a discussion of the loss of the MA, which I assume is a Master of Arts,
right,
as a genuine degree, which means it'd be like a separate degree. Because like now, if you get a master's, it really is just kind of like a pre-PhD or something. It's like pre-law. Pre-law is nothing. Pre-med is nothing. It's just the required classes you have to take before you get to medical school or law school. Is that what he's really talking about there?
So I think what he's talking about is like it's kind of going back to that distinction between like the research focus and just like the exam focus. Because when I applied to Oxford and got accepted, like the two options to apply was you either do, they call it, I think it's the MPhil, the Master of Philosophy, and it's either taught or it's research based. And so like the taught degree would be 2 years long, and you just like coursework, learning, reading, take a big exam at the end essentially. Then the research degree would be like a 1 year program where you already come in with a topic in mind and you just do research on that through Oxford for like a period of 9 months.
Interesting.
So I think that's what he's talking about, is like the continued focus away from the taught program into like the research. And that's what, the university overall was encouraging at the time. And I think up to the present day is more of the research things, because that's something you can like brag about and put statistics out about. It's like, look at all the students we have publishing their research in this journal, and this journal, and this journal.
Got it.
It's not as impressive, or at least it's not perceived as impressive, if you just have a bunch of students who like, look how many students came through our school and took a test. Right. It's not something that's easily as quantifiable as like the research component.
Yeah. Interesting.
So yeah, I think that distinction has been really lost in most programs. So you don't really hear about people going to grad school like just for the taught component. It's more so the research-based stuff.
All right, so I got another question. He mentions on 229, he says I must say something about our main business, the final honor school. What is that? Is that like the PhD, or what do you even know? I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's something that doesn't even exist anymore.
I'm not 100% sure. From what I gather, it's just like a more rigorous program within the school. Yeah. He says, it is in any case, I suppose, obvious that our honor syllabus is overcrowded and that the changes that come into force next year have not done much to cure this. And he goes on talking really about like university politics there, as we're putting too many people in the honors course rather than sort of sifting people out based on their actual like aptitude.
All right, because that's when he kind of leads into this discussion of the Lang and Lit factional fightings. Language versus, I guess be the study of English language and then English literature. Right. Because you have different degrees. You have like English, like even today, you have an English degree or English literature degree, and I don't know what you have to say. I was like, he says he first joined the school in 1912. But I guess was he in the university and then he went to war and then came back?
So he was a student. I suppose he did, and then went to war. And then I know he was a lecturer at Leeds University, or at least had some job there, and then came back as a professor at Oxford.
Yeah, all right, very good.
Yeah, but I like what he says because he's talking about, the full title of the school is the Honor School of English Language and Literature. And so everybody in the audience kind of knows that. So he introduces it as these two legendary figures, the bogies Lang and Lit. So I prefer to call them, since the words language and literature, though commonly misused among us, should not be thus degraded. He's like, you're not really learning language or literature when in this weird sort of split that we have in the school. And he gives this analogy. He says, popular mythology seems to believe that Lang came from a cuckoo egg laid in the nest, in which he takes up too much room and usurps the worms of the Lit chicken. Some believe that Lit was the cuckoo bent on extruding her nest fellow or sitting on him, and they have more support from the actual history of our school, but neither tale is well founded. He says, really, you should be looking at this as if they're two sides of one thing, as opposed to two opposing forces fighting each other to get more students within their own camp. He says, You can't really have one without the other, and that's what he kind of talks about throughout the rest here.
Because he goes into great detail about this dispute between the literature people and the language people, and I get his point, but I'm like, I don't know what we want to talk about. If you want,
I think this is a really important point.
Oh, really?
I think so, absolutely. Because he's essentially saying, like, you cannot have an understanding of the literature unless you have a proper understanding of the language, right? Yes. And he makes that a point, pretty clearly there, where it's like, well, if you talk about poetry, well, how are you going to talk about the poetry if you don't have an understanding of the meter or the rhythm and things like that? Those are language components that people are too quick to kind of throw aside and instead write papers about, well, what's like the author's intent in writing this? It's like you can write that about anything. The fact that it's poetry is important, right? And that requires you to actually look at the language and the history of the words that are being used and things like that. He says those things are too quickly thrown aside on the literature side. What's a little more interesting to me, I think, is his points about if you want to learn about language, you also have to learn about literature. Because modern linguistics, generally speaking, doesn't really care about the literature side of things. And I think I've complained about that on this podcast before, where it's like just become this weird like analytical degree where you don't really consider language outside of like spoken language. That's like the ideal sort of data to study, because that tells us more, at least sort of in the framework, like about what's going on in the mind when you use language like in a spoken format, sort of the grammatical rules that are somehow embedded in the mind, as opposed to like, well, what do we do with language, right? That side of things isn't as considered, and when it is considered, the scholarship's usually really, really bad and working on some really bad sort of philosophical schools of thought. And so it's like you don't really consider, like very rarely in a linguistics class will you ever talk about poetry. Like poetry's never brought up, at least, generally speaking, unless you take a very specific course like the linguistics of poetry, which I don't know has ever been taught at the University of Florida or anything like that. And so you don't consider like the art form of the language or the actual use of language, like in writing or in artistic ways, really hardly at all.
Well, it seems like, just from an outsider, that what you're describing is more of like a speech therapy or speech medical type study.
It is very medically inclined, well, at least like cognitively inclined at this point, which I don't think it used to be throughout the whole history of linguistics, but it is very concerned with like, okay, how does the mind actually function? How does the brain process language? Is more so the focus of, I would say, 90% of linguists, as opposed to like, what language itself is.
Yeah.
I was talking with a bunch of people about this topic over the past few days at that seminar that I was at, because not a lot of people really generally know what linguistics actually is, and I don't blame them at all, because nobody's ever met a linguist before, and nobody's dumb enough to go into the field, with some minor exceptions.
We should write like a children's book, superhero book, The Linguist, or you have to have some, I don't know what the powers would be.
Yeah,
but go ahead.
Nothing good.
There's got to be some sort of superpower that'd be really kind of fun.
He'd have the power to subcreate. Going back to the Don Fairy stories, there you go.
It's more a philosophical, theological thing.
Yes, but that's kind of what I was talking about. Is that I think there needs to be a lot more philosophy, if not theology, in linguistics. Because when I was talking to people, I was saying like my big problem is we're most sort of talking about the models of how we can get like an accurate idea of the output of language, rather than talking about the thing itself. I don't know if I've ever like showed you pictures of like syntax trees or like the stuff that we actually do in linguistics courses.
I've not seen that.
You don't need to. Imagine just a bunch of branches and words, and you're moving nodes into different parts of the tree, and the determiner phrase goes into the, blah, 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 blah. Or it's like you just have a bunch of, it's from what I've seen, it's more so discussing the models rather than discussing the thing that the models are supposed to be modeling. And so it's like you look at new linguistics research, it's always like, here's how this data in this small language can help us better fit this model that we're working with to how theoretically language might function.
Yeah.
You don't have a lot of papers really talking about what language is, like from a philosophical standpoint, from like what is this thing that we're studying.
Well, it seems like, and it's just of course, you're just explaining this to me for the first time. It seems like to me that language tree model and analysis of languages would be, that entire field of study will probably be wiped out by AI in about 5 years. I mean, because if it's formulaic and it's studying the relationship, and if you can have enough variables in there, I mean, that's more of it's almost like a software. What are the like basic or what are the computer languages they program in?
Yeah.
Fortran or what are the new ones? That's from
No
the 80s. COBOL, that might have been into the 90s.
I know C++.
Yeah, that
Python,
might have been right around there too. Yeah, Python, I think was after that. That just kind of strikes me as more clerical.
Yeah, that's been my like big problem with the whole field, is that it is very clerical.
Yes.
It is very like, how do we organize the data into a structure that makes sense? And it's like that is a good thing to do, but I don't think that's all of it. And I think it's mistaking the model for the thing itself. You're studying the model rather than studying language.
Right.
And it's each like subfield has a different sort of similar problem. Like that's the problem of like syntax and morphology. So like the structure of sentences and the structure of words is all in like how do we create a diagram that sort of maps all the movement and how sort of which parts have domain over other things. In phonology, it's more so. There's a bunch of different rules or different like diagrams for how you can get to like the phonological rules, like present in the language rules or constraints, depending on your school of thought. But it's like really sort of modeling how do we get like a proper system for how we get the output of what language is rather than studying language. Yeah,
it seems to me that that the universal translator that they use in Star Trek, we're very close to that.
Yeah. Like, I mean, yeah.
Like already we're close to it.
Yeah, I mean, you have like the Google like Gemini glasses with the Ray-Bans, or it's like you can like see the text that someone's talking to you. Yeah, right. And so it's pretty good.
Yeah, interesting. All right, yeah, I tend to agree with what your sentiment, because it's like you're not really studying to be essentially a file clerk.
Yeah.
Yeah, because
that's really studying language.
That's what they're kind of advocating for.
And there is still some good work being done. Like I think a lot of the language documentation stuff is still very good, and there's still decent papers put out every once in a while. But it's like the core of the field is just like modeling. Yeah, it's very
interesting.
Like, in many places, it gets more to like a computer science course rather than 100%. Like the actual yeah. But and I think I might have mentioned this at least. It's like if you ask a linguist like what language is, you kind of get like two different camps of people. Like you have a very like materialist view where it's like, well, language is just the output of like neurons firing in our brain. That's all it is. If you kind of map the neurons and you have language. The other side is kind of just like completely agnostic, where it's like, well, we don't really know what this thing is, or it's so hard to define what this thing is, because what's the difference between a language and a dialect? What is this capacity that we have, that it's kind of just like, well, we're not really as concerned with that as we are just concerned with the output of this sort of nebulous thing that we claim to be studying. Yes. And a lot of it's very like, well, it's just like a tool for communication. That's all it is this sort of nebulous idea that we have somewhere.
Did we have a conversation about this recently, or was it just in my mind with myself? But I've been really thinking about Tolkien's creator and sub-creator issues. And it's, that whole philosophy, and he's convinced me, even though he's not here and he's not speaking with me, but reading his stuff, that I've always had an issue. I'm sorry, go off a tangent. I've always had an issue with, or I was confused by the biblical references to us being created in God's image. Like, what does that mean? I mean, like he looks like a dude or a woman, I mean, like a mammal. And that didn't seem. I'm like, that's just stupid. Yeah. I mean, because it doesn't make any sense, because he doesn't have a shape. Yeah. As far as I know, and so then what does it really mean? It means like our soul or our purpose is in his image, which is Tolkien's argument that his ultimate essence is as creator. Right. And so then, if we're created in his image, Tolkien's argument is, well, then we're the sub-creators. We're created to create ourselves, or among ourselves and all that stuff. Where's my point to that? And then that's really what separates us from the animals, is this creativity. And what is language but creating communication? And that's how we're able to facilitate creativity as individuals and as a group and a society. If you don't have language, you can't share the vast majority of your creative thoughts.
Right.
So, I think it's because we're not just, hairy apes that can communicate. We're more than that. Right. Or not hairy apes.
Yes.
Less hairy apes. Some of us. Or some of you. Anyway, so...
yeah, because kind of the textbook answer to how we're made in the image and likeness of God is that we have an intellect and free will. Yes. Right? Like God does not look like us because, like you said, God has no form except for in the incarnation. Where he did have an actual.
But the free will, the intellect and free will. I think dogs have that.
No, they don't.
You don't think they have an intellect?
No, not in the way that we do.
Well, I agree with that to a point, but there are intellectual humans and there are not very intellectual humans, and they're still creating God's image.
Right. So it's like there are some animals that come close to the threshold. I think this goes all the way back to
Are you talking about the intellect or the free will?
Both. Well, maybe not so much free will, but on the intellect point.
Well, do you think that dogs have free will?
No.
You think they're deterministic?
No. I don't think that they. No. Free will, classically understood, doesn't mean
the ability to make choices and intelligently decide between options and pick one.
Yes, and so it means that
you don't think that's what it is.
No, because we operate in terms of reason. So intellect and free will are kind of tied in that way. Dogs do not have reason. They are not, when they think something, if they think anything at all, it's based on instinct, right? They do not have the level of intellect, right? Because they do not have a rational soul. They have what's the name of the soul? It's Aquinas is 3 different types of souls. You have the vegetative soul. You have the I'm blanking on the word
the
for
dog soul.
The dog soul. It's the instinctual soul and then the rational soul. And humans are the only kind that have a rational soul. And so the soul is what gives unity to a thing. This is kind of going on a way different tangent here.
Okay.
But dogs do not have that same ability. They do not have anything that they can subject their will to. They do not have a reason they can think through things and think, oh wait, there is a bigger thing at play here, rather than positive or negative. This is what I should do. This is what I shouldn't do. They do not have any way of subjecting their will to a reason.
Ooh. That's a pretty broad statement.
That's true.
Yeah, I don't know about that. I'll have to think more about that. I have a real struggle with the arguments, and a lot of the animal rights advocates make these arguments about do animals have. Well, of course they argue, and I agree with them. They have an inherent value. I don't think there's any disagreement with that. And not on the on the conservation and in the stewardship side, I get all that. But I think they're, do they have a soul?
They have a soul, but they do not have a soul like we have a soul.
Do they have a soul that is eternal?
I don't think so.
It's interesting.
Well,
I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
And my dad struggled with that. He had cancer, and one of the things he wanted to know is if Teddy would be there, which is our old dog. And he had a dog as a child. Anyway, it's kind of funny what people think about. And then he also wondered if they had at least one stillborn. I know they had lost 2 babies, but one was a stillborn, which is a different type of loss, I think.
Right.
Rather than a miscarriage, which I don't think. I don't think in the essence of being it there's any difference, but it's a different kind of loss. If it gets to that point of development, you feel it more, I think. But in any event, and so those are interesting questions. But that's completely
I think
aside.
it's an interesting topic.
Yeah.
Because children that are lost, like soon after childbirth or stillborn, they certainly have an animal soul. You have or not an animal soul, a human soul.
What?
Yeah, no, human soul, like from the moment of conception. That's a human life.
Correct.
So they have an eternal soul.
Right.
Very likely that they will be in heaven, or we hope so at least. But on the question of like animals, if they will be in heaven, the consensus is no, because heaven is like just eternal contemplation of God. And animals, it's like, because there's nothing like that an animal would do up there. Like animals don't have a contemplation of God. They don't know what God is. They just don't have that rational soul. So there's no purpose for them in heaven, you know?
What's an old joke? The dyslexic agnostic just sits around all day and contemplating the meaning of dog. Anyway. Whether or not dog exists.
That's ridiculous.
All right, let's go back to the readings.
Yes.
Stupid joke.
Yes, where were we? We were talking about language and literature.
Yes, and he has this long debate about. I get his conclusion is that it should just be the Department of Language, I guess, or English, or not even. I guess English with a capital E.
He said, if the title then is he said if the title then is made explicit, it should be the School of English Language. That's at the top of 232. The parallel formulas held good enough for our peers for French and Italian and others. He says, and I think that's a good point. Like if you take a French degree in college, you're not just learning the language, you're also learning the literature. You don't feel the need to distinguish between the two. He says, why do we, as an English university, like you say, well, you could only learn one or the other, or you should only learn one or the other. But he says, let me say that actually for reasons that I will give, I should be well content with literature if letters is now too archaic. He's like, even if you do want to boil it down to just the School of English Literature, that should inherently also encapsulate English language, because you need the language to understand the literature. Those should not just be completely separate. Yeah. And I like the story that he gives, where he says, of course it can be objected that English in an English-speaking university is in a different position from other letters. The English language is assumed to be, and usually is, the native language of the students. They do not have to learn it. As a venerable professor of chemistry once said to me, I hasten to add that he is dead and did not belong to Oxford. Just completely insulting this guy. Wow. He says, I do not know why you want a Department of English Language. I know English, but I also know some chemistry. He says, like, that's the common attitude among a lot of people. It's like, why bother studying this? Well, I already know how the language works. I speak it, and I can also do other things. I don't need to learn about something I already know. He says, well, that's ridiculous. He says, I think it was a mistake to intrude language into our title in order to mark this difference or to warn those who are ignorant of their own ignorance. He says, by setting up this contrast, we would essentially set ourselves up to fail. If at once you say, well, these are two opposite things, then you're going to assume that one is not necessary for the other inherently.
Yes. I don't know if I'm jumping way too far ahead, but he gets a little spicy in his language. I think he was like he really wanted to get some of this stuff out there. But he's talking about 237. He says, "I'm going to read this if you don't mind. Sure. It's a little bit long. I have once or twice, not so long ago, been asked to explain or defend this language, to say, I suppose, how it could possibly be profitable or enjoyable." As if I were some curious wizard with arcane knowledge with a secret recipe that I was unwilling to divulge. And then I'll skip to the next paragraph. He says, to talk about, like, how do you know language? And he says, I did not accept the challenge. I did not answer, for I knew no answer that would not appear uncivil. But I might have said, if you do not know any language, learn some or try to. You should have done so long ago. The knowledge is not hidden. Grammar is for all intelligent persons, though not all may rise to star-spangled grammar. If you cannot learn or find the stuff distasteful, then keep humbly quiet. You are a deaf man at a concert. Carry on with your biography of the composer and do not bother about the noises that he makes. I just thought that was as strong a defense of the study of language as I have ever heard. And I love the analogy of, write about the composer if you're, if you don't understand music, about the sounds that are emanating. That analogy works for the study of language, because then you're just studying the words and you're not studying the prose or the art or whatever.
And especially as you get, farther and farther into these weird sort of theories that have been introduced into like literature studies, where it's like, well, what was, his family background and how did that determine, what his, writing was going to be.
Right.
And it's like some of that's important to have like the social context and things like that. But so much of like English studies, if you read a general English paper, you get into some weird topics about like how this piece actually represents, this weird thing that the author just wanted to construe into there and read into the paper. And I like what he says a little bit earlier on 237. It says, is it wicked to inquire in paper or viva voce what here or there Chaucer really meant by word or form or idiom? Is meter and verse technique of no concern to sensitive literary minds? And he says, like, you're so concerned with just trying to pull the meaning out of the work and like what it, these sort of weird papers not actually touching on the language that you're missing so much of it, right? I don't know if you saw this. This is something I saw on Twitter a while back, but some guy was bragging, like, I've read so many more classics this year because I've asked, like, ChatGPT just to give me summaries of all the main points. And he's like, I feel so much more well-informed. Yes. It's just a bunch of replies just completely, like, just roasting the guy. It's just like,
him,
yeah, because it's like, well, you haven't actually read anything at all, right?
Yes.
The classics, the reason that they're classic isn't just because they have a great moral message, right? That's part of it. And you can get sort of the main idea from, like, Cliff Notes or ChatGPT.
Sure.
But so much of it is in the writing itself that makes it such a classic. It's not just because they had something good to say, it's also how they said it. He says we've completely neglected a lot of the how they said it by separating them.
That's true. Very true.
And then on the opposite end of things, at least in modern linguistics, you're neglecting what they say instead of for how they said it. Just looking at purely the models of the language itself rather than what it's actually being used for.
Yes.
You look like you were about to say something here. You're pondering.
No, I'm pondering your brilliant thoughts. I don't really have much else to say, although he does thanks some particular people, including the kindness of William Craigie that he showed to a jobless soldier in 1918. So I guess he's I guess that guy must have given him a job.
Yeah, I think that was with the Oxford English Dictionary as one of his first jobs there.
Interesting.
Because I think he talks also about my first glimpse of the unique and dominant figure of Charles Talbot Onions darkly surveying me, a fledgling prentice in the dictionary room, fiddling with the slips for wag and walrus and wampum. He worked on the letter W for the Oxford English Dictionary, and so he spent so much time just looking at where all of these words that start with W like have appeared throughout the entire history of the English language. And that was a big project for him.
It's funny.
Yeah, I like what he also says. Right after that section where he's talking about the analogy of the composer there. He says, I have said enough, perhaps more than enough for this occasion. I must now get out of the chair and finally stand down. I have not made any effective apologia pro consulatum meo, not any effective defense for my position, for none is really possible. Perhaps probably my best act in it is the leaving of it, especially in handing it on to its elected occupant, Norma Davis. Already one of the chairborne, he will know that in the cozy cushions which legend furnishes for professorial seats, many thorns lurk among the stuffing. He can have those too, with my blessing. So it's like, it's not always the most fun job leading this school of people, as he's kind of implied throughout here, is that you have so many debates and so many, people trying to argue, that you could only focus on the literature, only focus on the language, which clearly just drove him crazy.
Yes.
And I like also how he concludes, and just this is the last word of the whole book here. He says, but now when I survey with eye or mind those who may be called my pupils, rather in the sense the apples of my eyes, those who have taught me much, who have gone on to a learning to which I have not attained, or when I see how many scholars could more than worthily have succeeded me, then I perceive with gladness that the Duguth, which is this word for the noble company in a king's hall, has not fallen by the wall, and the dream is not yet silenced, which is where we get the word dream, but it's the sound of their glad voices and the music of their feasts, as it says in a note. And so I can see all the people before me. They're still like this company within this hall of the king, and they're still singing songs and praising language and literature. So it was a really, really nice place to end.
Yes. It's such an effective defense of such an esoteric and little-known subject.
Right.
People, like you said, every time I mention to anybody, I don't volunteer it because you know what your son's doing? They all in college. Yeah, Sam's there and Adam's, PhD down in Florida, and they say, oh, what's he studying? Oh, he's studying linguistics. Like, what is that even for? I don't know. Sometimes I'll explain it, but it takes a few minutes.
Yeah.
You know, like you have to say what it is, and they're like, "Oh, yeah, do with that."
Yeah.
I said, "Well, I guess he's going to keep studying it. I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll make a new language."
No, I've had to do that so many times because a lot of people think it's just like an English degree.
Yes.
And then a lot of people also think it's
like a speech therapy
degree,
yes.
which is related topics and things. And then I also always get the question every single time anyone asks, "Oh, well, how many languages do you speak? You know, how many languages do you need to know for that?" Well, technically, you don't need to know any specific language because saying language, but yeah.
Right.
I digress. But what do you think of the book overall?
Well, before I go to that, I'm reminded when I get these questions about your degree is the hundreds, if not thousands, of questions when I was getting a philosophy degree from UMSL. What are you going to do with that? So that's when I came up with the street philosopher. 7-Eleven manager was one. I'd say, like a straight face. I'm going to be assistant night manager of 7-Eleven. I just deadpan it. Okay. Yeah, that's going to help you with that. Absolutely. If you've been to a 7-Eleven in the middle of the night, you need to be a philosopher.
That's ridiculous.
At 3 a.m.
Yeah.
You got to be prepared.
That's when all the philosophers come out. Well, you'll have some interesting debates.
Deep thinkers.
7-Eleven.
All right, back to the book.
Yes.
So, at some point, maybe you'll just say absurd things.
Yeah.
Because especially since the program's a long time.
Right. I still have 4 more years.
At some point, you will get fed up with the questions and you'll just start making up absurd career references. Or at least I would. I encourage that kind of stupidity. I like the book. Yeah. I mean, he's of course a great writer. My of course you're not gonna like this. My criticism of like the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit is that there's a lot of stuff in there, a lot of detail, and you're like, okay, where is this headed? Well, we're not headed anywhere. He just has a limerick or whatever. There's this character is singing this song for the next 3 pages. And then you're like, do I need to read that? I guess I don't want to miss something in the plot. So these are much more precise.
Right.
And so you get and for me, I get to enjoy his writing and his prose, I guess you'd say, I always say this, how he turns a phrase. And so I enjoyed reading them, and I enjoyed his defense of what he does or what he did for a living, essentially his career, what his interests were, and he seems a little bit more acerbic than I had anticipated in his comments, although polite and very he's insulting people in very a very erudite way.
Yeah. I'd say so. I'd say so.
I thought I needed to use a bigger word.
Yeah, so to describe Tolkien, there's never any word big enough.
What are your thoughts? I assume that you thought it was mediocre.
Yeah, no, it was okay.
Waste of time.
No, it's a complete waste of time to read and talk about this. No, because I've read all of these before. I've had this copy for many years.
That's cheating.
It's not cheating. But no, I thought it's. I mean, they're all fantastic. And now I've come back to them. It's been a couple years since I've actually read through them, except for on fairy stories, which I've read many times. But I think it is true, and I know I've mentioned this before. Like I think he's very much underrated as a philosopher / somewhat of a theologian as well.
Yes.
With how, especially on fairy stories, it's where he makes it the most explicit. But also in several of the others, just like the importance of language, tying that into bigger topics that I think, as I've kind of alluded to, like this sort of writing is very much missing in people who study language these days. You don't see things like this too often. It's very rare that you have that. You're seeing Tolkien referenced much more often, like in philosophy and in theology. Like I have read papers like talking about St. Thomas Aquinas, and they will reference like Tolkien as sort of like an authoritative source of how some of these ideas are like adopted in the modern day. You're seeing a lot of interest in him among conservatives, among very religious people who are looking for, I think, a much fuller idea of like what creation is, of what literature should be, about why language is important. I mean, all the topics we've been talking about this whole time. And so I think he will just get more and more important, especially as you kind of move away. I mean, I don't think anybody will ever really move away from like the Lord of the Rings as like the chief interest in Tolkien scholarship. Yeah. But I think people are appreciating more and more that there's more to Tolkien than just Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit and the Silmarillion and all the Middle Earth stuff. Although all of the ideas in here are very much present in all those books as well. Yeah.
Right. No, I enjoyed it. It's good points.
Yeah.
And he seemed like a neat dude.
Yeah.
A righteous dude.
Yeah, righteous dude.
As they would say in Ferris Bueller's Day Off.
And I think that the last essay gives us a good kind of
Segue,
transition into
yes.
the next book, which is Saul Bellow's Closing of the American Mind.
Yes.
Or no, not Saul Bellow.
Not Saul Bellow.
Alan Bloom's Closing of the American Mind with a foreword by Saul Bellow. Which I don't know if you saw that on there. That was your pick for
That was
the
my
next season.
pick, and I don't know much about it. So we have the book. I have not opened it yet.
Yes. I know a little bit about it, very vague
A
things,
summary.
but it's
I haven't read anything. It's like I don't pick books that I've already read like you do.
Yeah. Well, I've only done that a couple times.
I pick books that I've been meaning to read and have not yet read.
Yes. Well, I thought this would be good for us to read and talk about here.
No, I'm not criticizing you.
But Closing the American Mind is all about generally the American education system, how it's failed a lot of Americans, how it's closed the American mind, how you need a broader appreciation of a lot of history and philosophy and things like that. So it should be good to read for season 12.
Yes.
Been doing this for a long time.
And we're going to take next week off. We're going to plow right into it.
We can take next week off.
Okay, we can.
We can, if you want to.
Well, then we'll
We're gonna
start
have to.
the same week that I'm starting another semester in higher education.
Perfect timing. All right, well, this has been, unless you have any other final thoughts.
No, I don't.
This has been season 11, episode 8 of Unlimited Opinions. I've been Adam Bishop.
Still Mark Bishop.
And you can, of course, follow us on Twitter at ULMTD Opinions.